Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, to wrap up my coverage of Survivor 41, and what's now become a tradition, we're going to be doing a player ranking for the season, ranking every player from the season of 41 based on how I feel like they played on this season. So here we do have 18 players to rank, and in general I will say that 41 is probably a difficult ranking to put together, largely because I feel like so many of the top contenders are very close. To me, this is a season without a very clear number one player. It did make it a bit interesting to put this list together, but obviously we will talk through it. But with that, let's start off at the bottom. The person who I think played the worst game on Survivor 41 is Abraham, the first boot. Not too surprising, but I will say that, like, to me, I don't think Abraham did that much wrong to be the first boot. It's like he is largely on the bottom here just because, like, he is the first boot. He wasn't able to really do much and didn't really have much potential moving forward. But that being said, again, like, I don't think he does that much actively wrong. I mean, yes, he does try to target Tiffany in a position where there's already an all-girls alliance, but, like, that's not that bad of a thing. Like, coming into the season, I was expecting Eric to be a terrible player and, like, overly blow up his own game, but that didn't really seem to be the case. He just seems to be fine here. Again, he is obviously the first boot in a position where he kind of gets singled out for being an outlier on the tribe. It didn't seem like he made too many great relationships where, like, we don't see him really make any alliances or anything. You can assume that he was probably working with the guys based on how the tribe layout was, but even they were willing to vote him out. And, like, Abraham didn't really have much going for him, but I don't think he did that much actively wrong on this season. So while he is at the bottom here, he's probably better than a lot of other people that would be on the bottom on any other given season. But I can't argue it's better than any of the other people on this cast, so because that he does land here number 18. At number 17, it's surprisingly the second boot on the season, and that is Sarah, who, I mean, is debatably the first boot, along with Abraham. But Sarah, to me, I think is a player that had more potential moving forward. And that is the main reason I do have her higher than Abraham, where Abraham didn't really have any alliances. He didn't really have any path moving forward. Sarah did have a 3 with Shan and Ricard. Also, she was much closer to pulling off a flip than Abraham was, where there was obviously the live tribal. And again, there would have been a lot of potential for them to flip the votes onto Brad had Shan not been against the plan. I think she would have had potential moving forward. But despite all those things, again, she is the first boot here. I do think she plays a bit too passively early on, where it doesn't seem like she made that many deep connections on this tribe. She was obviously outside of the initial core power structure, which was the Shan, JD, Genie, Brad grouping. And while she does, again, have a decent relationship with Ricard and eventually Shan, it's like Shan also had literally everyone else on the tribe. Yeah, I do think Sarah didn't really build the bonds that she needed to. I think she played a bit too passively. But yeah, I don't think in the grand scheme of things she's that bad of a player. I think she's a player that definitely has potential. But based on how they played on this season, there isn't really much to go off of. At least she had more potential moving forward. She almost caused a flip. That's enough to put her above Abraham for me. She's here at 17. Now, number 16, we do have some of those but a few more rounds later, and that person is Genie. Now, for me, Genie is a tough one to rank because obviously she makes it farther than some other people we're going to talk about not too soon afterwards. But she is the last pre-merge boot. She gets down to the final 3 on her tribe, and that alone is impressive as a stat. However, I feel like when we look at the actuality of how these rounds played out, I don't think Genie does that much. Now, again, I think she is also a very passive player in the game, but one that did make stronger social bonds than Sarah, where Genie was, again, part of that initial core power structure. She did seem to have a very strong relationship with both Shan and Brad. The problem is that she was kind of the third in that, where Brad was always more loyal to Shan, and Shan was, like, had loyalties to everyone. So Genie never really solidly had her person, despite the fact that she thought it was Brad. So I think that is a knock against her there. Again, I do think she plays very passively up until the point where Brad ends up going home, where even at the first tribal, she votes for Ricard because she was left out of the vote and got confused over who they were voting for. At the JD boot, I don't feel like she does that much well to keep herself in the game. If not anything, she does the opposite, where she argues with her tribe immediately after coming back to tribal, which, if anything, ruins her chances of potentially staying long term. And we have her finding the Beware advantage, which could have potentially saved her in the episode that she goes home, but she decides to share it with Ricard and Shan, who end up stealing it from her. And to go even beyond this, like, I just don't feel like Genie had much potential coming into the merge either, where to me, Genie just feels like a massive outlier on this cast, someone that didn't really have that much agency in the game. And while like it's not out of the realm of possibility for her making a deep run on the season, I find it very tough to believe that a jury would reward her with the win by the end. So again, for me, I just feel like Genie's game is overall pretty bad, and she does land here at number 16. Now at number 15, we're moving back a few spots to Brad. And Brad is an interesting figure here, where I think on paper you would say, okay, Brad played a terrible game. Again, there's so many moves that Brad makes across the season that are pretty bad. You have him telling Shan and Sarah to their faces that they are the potential boots. That's pretty bad, to the point where Sarah wants to flip the vote onto Brad immediately afterwards. And he does seem to lose trust with Shan, someone that he considered his closest ally at that point, which is even more asinine. Round 2, he's openly running around back and forth between Camp and the Water Well to spy on JD and Ricard, which again, once again, sketches Shan out, which obviously ends up leading to his demise. Though I will say that he does seem to have a knack for finding advantages. He obviously found both of the Beware advantages available on this tribe. He had the idol and the steal a vote at the time that he was voted out, and I do feel like that alone shows that he has some potential in the game, that he was able to find those things, and had he been able to play more optimally, he probably could have at least made a deeper run with those things. Obviously, he ends up telling Shan about those things, which again further sketch him out. Really, I mean, I think the biggest flaw in Brad's game is his loyalty to Shan. I mean, his loyalty to Shan in the sense that he openly comes off as scheming to Shan, thinking that he's building trust with her, but instead it's actually causing her to distrust him, largely because she already has a closer number one person in Ricard. So again, to me, it's like Brad just put all of his trust in the wrong person here. That does end up being a major knock against his game. But again, he does seem to have some natural game ability with his ability to find advantages. He was part of the initial majority, and despite the fact that he wasn't as loyal to Genie as she was to him, again, he still had Genie being super loyal to him. He had Tiffany and Sydney agree to give him the steal a vote at the summit, which I also think is impressive on his end. So again, he does have impressive elements of his game, but he's still a relatively early boot, largely due to all the missteps he makes in relation to his relationship with Shan. And also, he does also burn his relationship with JD as well, so it's again not great in the grand scheme of things, but at least there are some merits to his game, which is why he's here number 15. Now number 14, we're moving one spot higher. We do have JD. And JD's a tough one to rank here because I think JD is a player that, again, has some potential in him. He clearly knows the game pretty well. It's just a matter of his execution of it that I do think is very faulty. Now, right away, he is part of the initial power structure. Again, it was a 4-person alliance at the beginning of UA, and he does create this bond with Shan that probably does keep him in longer than it should have, but almost everything else about his game is pretty bad. I mean, you do have him lying about his extra vote, which no one ends up believing, and eventually, like, he just wears his extra vote around his pants to the point where Shan just sees it. Like, that was just kind of weird. We have him giving his extra vote to Shan twice, which is ridiculous. And while, like, realistically, it doesn't play that much of a factor in anything, it is still kind of humorous that he ends up doing it twice on the season. He does end up sketching out Brad to the point where Brad is actively targeting him after that first round. He is obviously taken out over Genie, but to be fair there, I don't really have as much fault in that, considering, again, I feel like in the choice between him and Genie, it's like he's clearly the bigger threat there. But again, I think he's another one that probably put too much trust in Shan at points, and outside of that, just played a messier game. The reason he is above Brad, though, is one, he does outlast Brad, but also he's someone that, again, I think would have had more potential had he been able to make it into a merge situation, where by that point we obviously do see the Black Alliance come together, and that's obviously something that he was very close to being able to be a part of. But really, to me, it's like, again, like the debate between him and Brad is actually pretty close, and I do think you could technically go either way, but I decided to give the edge slightly to JD here. Now number 13, we're moving on to the final pre-merge boot, actually, and getting them all done in a row, and here we do have Voce. And Voce is an interesting one here because he is someone that does end up being only the third boot of his season, gets taken out of the second tribal that he attends, but I do struggle with figuring out how much fault to really give him for that. Where, again, he does survive a tribal where he does vote out Abraham, but through that he does end up putting himself down in the numbers where him and Xander were clearly outnumbered afterwards, though they did think that they were working with Evie, which again, credit to Evie for that. But once he gets to that final 5 situation, like, it's either Voce or Xander getting the boot there, and for most of that round, it did very much seem like it was going to be Xander, until on the show it's perceived as Tiffany misunderstanding the rules and flipping the vote onto Voce due to that, which if that is truly the case, then that's a very luck-based way for Voce to go out, where, again, like, I don't find much fault in him going out in that situation. But according to Tiffany post-season, she's talked about how that was an active decision where she actively wanted to keep Xander in the game and she wanted to get rid of Voce, which in that case you would obviously knock him a bit more. But either way, like, I just feel like Voce, like, did little wrong and was kind of just already in a bad spot just due to the natural makeup of the tribe. I think the 3 women that were on that tribe were always going to work together early on. So the biggest potential for this game would have been the last man standing, which obviously doesn't end up happening. And again, how much fault do you really give him for that? But to me, again, like, I feel like he seemed like a competent player out there. He seemed to have a pretty rational mind for the game. I just think he was naturally put into a position where I don't see how he really does that well unless he gets into the merge. So really, I just kind of feel like he gets unlucky with the draw he was given here. But obviously not enough to the point where I can put him much higher than people that did end up making it to merge, especially when he's, again, the third boot of the season. So because he does land here at 13. Now number 12, where we're going to be talking about the worst player that made the merge to me. And this was a bit of a debate. I did think about this for a while. However, I do think I have to put Sydney. It's a weird one because, like, I don't know how much longevity Sydney realistically had in the game. I do think Sydney is someone that, like, very much would have been a boot at any of the early merge tribals on this season. But I do think she gets massively screwed over in the fact that she does get booted at the merge tribal itself. Where had it not been for the hourglass twist, Erica was the very clear target. Erica would have gone home. But once that twist ends up happening, it gets flipped on to the people that won the challenge. But even then, Evie is the target over Sydney. And Evie was supposed to be voted out had the idol not been a factor there. And even then, she gets unlucky that the knowledge power doesn't end up working, as that also makes it so that the votes end up piling on her. And also, she gets unlucky that she's in a grouping where Ricard wins immunity and Evie can be handed the idol by Xander, and then Nasir has an idol of his own, meaning that it's the core Luvu of her, Danny, and Shan that are mainly vulnerable here. Also, we have the factor in that she uses her shot in the dark, where if she hadn't done so, she would have caused a tie, where in that situation, Evie would have gone home in the revote. So again, there's really just so many little things that had to go wrong to cause Sydney to go home here that makes me want to put her higher on the list, just due to how unlucky she gets over the fact that she gets booted here. But I will say that I just don't think she played that well outside of that, and that's the main reason she isn't that much higher. Again, in the pre-merge, yes, she was aligned with Danny and the Shan, but from what we've learned post-season is the fact that supposedly the Shan was willing to get rid of Sydney very early on. And if Erica had not been in committal to that plan, Sydney would have been the clear target had they gone to a tribal in the later pre-merge. We also see her having really bad relationships with Nasir and Erica and Heather, to where they all talk negatively about her in confessional. It really felt like Danny was like the only person that actively wanted to keep her around. So I do think that is a major knock there as well. I also feel, again, I don't see much potential for her moving forward, even if she had survived this round. So because of that, she does land here at number 12. Now number 11, moving on to another Luvu member. Here we do have Nasir. Now Nasir, to me, I did debate on because, like, I actually really don't think Nasir played a good game either. Nasir is someone that could have potentially been the first boo. I don't think he is. Again, I think they would have gone for Heather over him, but he definitely wasn't part of that initial power structure on the Luvu tribe. And while he does ingrain himself within that, I feel like that's largely due to his physical strength and his challenge strength at that point. And also the fact that so many men had been going home in the pre-merge that made Danny and the Shan feel more incentivized to work with Nasir. But even then, coming into the merge, he was just such a massive target. And while he does avoid being voted for at the Sydney round, largely due to him threatening people with his idol, it was very clear that Nasir was going to be taken out pretty soon afterwards. And he's a target once again at the Tiffany vote, where there is talk about blindsiding him with the idol. It doesn't end up going through, but eventually does in the very next round, which seemed to largely happen due to his misplaced trust into Shan, which again is a common occurrence on the season. But again, for me, it's like, I don't think he played that well here. And for me, there's also like a debate of like, should he even be higher than Sydney? Because he never really had that many relationships in the game. I don't think he had that much of a path forward. So yeah, I do think it's pretty close. However, I just decided to go from Nasir above Sydney. One, because he does technically outplay Sydney at that merge tribal, where through his threatening of people with the idol, he does end up keeping himself safe. And then also, I do feel like he would have had a lot more potential to potentially win a jury vote had he gotten to the end, with him being a very likable figure. While I do struggle with seeing Sydney win a jury vote. So because of that, again, I leaned toward Nasir here, but it wasn't by much. Now number 10, moving on to a bit of a surprise for me. They end up being this low on the list, but again, I feel like it fits. We do have Evie. And Evie is an interesting figure here because Evie's someone that very clearly knows the game pretty well. Very clearly one of, I think, the better players on a grander scale. However, considering how they played on this season, I do think they played a flawed game. Now, they played a really good early game. Earlier in the game, I do think they took control of the Yasa tribe, created this all-girls alliance, and ended up sticking together up until the merge. Seemed to build strong relationships with Liana and Tiffany and Xander along the way. Was able to trick the guys into thinking that they were working with them. And again, like, all that is pretty strong gameplay. Also built the bond with the Shan. That could have potentially helped her come into the merge. So again, like, I do think there are good elements of her game in the pre-merge. However, I just feel like her post-merge is very bad. Or at that point, there's such a massive target in the game and are really just skating by tribal after tribal. Again, the hourglass twist is very wonky, but with that in play, they are a target there and does get saved due to the threat of Xander's idol, where if that had not been the case, I do think Evie would have been the clear boot there. Immediately afterwards, she wins immunity in a position where she probably gets voted out as well at the final 11. And even if she doesn't, she would have been a massive target there to where she once again would have barely squeaked through. And eventually they get voted out at the split tribal, where the Shan actively tricks her and proceeds to vote her out there in a position where she could have easily saved herself. I mean, there were many roads to them staying in the game there, and they just don't go through with it, whether that be from getting Xander to use the idol on her, or getting Xander to use the extra vote to keep them in the game, or from being able to actually flip the Shan over, or from rekindling her relationship with Liana and getting Liana to flip over. Like, there were so many options that she's unable to execute on any of them. I feel like that's also an issue there. Now, the one redeeming quality here is that I do think if she had survived that tribal, they would have been in a pretty good spot at that point. I mean, they would have been able to go along with the Shan blindside, and from that point forward, while being a big threat, would have been one of like 3 big threats left in the game with her, Ricard, and Erica, to where who knows if Evie would have been able to squeak her way to the end and potentially win a jury vote. But again, I do find her early merge portion of the game to be very lackluster, and because of that, they end up landing here at number 10. Now number 9, another Yasa member. Here we do have Tiffany, and Tiffany's an interesting one to rank here, as I think there are obviously arguments that Evie should be higher. I think Evie probably had more overall potential to for sure win the game. However, I feel like Tiffany was better positioned, at least in the merge section of the game, than her, and then just kind of gets unlucky with how certain things play out. I mean, we see her obviously very early on be part of the all-girls alliance on Yasa that ends up controlling the entire pre-merge there, where despite her being a very easy person to vote off, and Abraham directly targeting her, they do end up voting out Abraham and follow that up by voting out Voce, which, again, is not a great look that she seemed to be confused over how Xander's idol ends up working, but she still does get her way there in voting out Voce against the will of Evie and Liana, who did not want that to happen. And really beyond that, she was being portrayed as a savvy player, picking up on Evie, Liana, and Xander's lies along the way, come into the merge. She's obviously on the bottom along with the other Yasas, and does get greatly benefited by the fact that the hourglass twist is in play, which makes her safe, obviously, in a position where I do think Erica would have been the boot, but I do think Tiffany would have probably been the backup option there. But I think her actual boot round at the final 11 was just very unlucky circumstances where there were so many things in play there, where you had Evie being the initial target and her winning immunity. You had Xander still having his idol, along with Nasir still having his idol. Two people that could have potentially been booted over her. You also had this big live tribal that supposedly did flip the votes onto her, while the entire intention of the live trial was to put votes onto Nasir, and the vote was going to be split between Tiffany and Xander. Supposedly some votes did flip to Tiffany through that process, and she ends up getting voted out there as well. Again, like, I just feel like that's kind of a weird way for her to be voted out there in a position where, again, like, if she had survived that round and gotten to the point where the majority flipped against each other, I think she would have been in a very strong position to at least make it to the end, and I think she would have had a shot at arguing her case for a win if she's not against the, again, Ricard, Erica, Evie's of the world. But I think she's largely taken out just due to how big of a threat the Yasa conglomerate is at that point, where I feel like she probably does the least wrong to cause her losing the game out of the Yasa members on this season. But again, considering how early of a boot she was, and also her still having some knocks along the way, I couldn't really put her too much higher, but I did still have her here at number 9. Now number 8, and this is probably the person on the list I'm the most conflicted about, largely due to the fact that I just feel like there are still so many unknowns on this person's game, largely because a lot of it wasn't shown, and when it was shown pretty negatively. But from what we've heard post-season, it does make me feel like I should bump them up a bit. So at number 8 here, we do have Heather. And again, Heather was someone that, coming into this video, I expected her to be the bottom ranked person out of anyone that made the merge here. Again, I really did not see much in Heather's game. And to be honest, I still have many flaws with Heather's game, which is the main reason she's still here at number 8. However, one thing that really recontextualizes things is the exit interviews. It pretty much implies that Heather would have won if she got to the end against the Shan and Xander, which was a somewhat realistic possibility by the time of the final 4. Now, while I still do think that Heather loses to Erica, it is still mind-blowing to me that this is even a situation that could happen, that Heather could win the game. Because again, that's definitely not something I was thinking was possible, but because it does seem somewhat possible at this point, I do feel like she should be at least this high on the list. However, I just can't really rationalize putting her up too much more, considering, one, again, it's still not a guarantee that she wins if she gets to the end, but also, I just feel like she actually plays pretty poorly outside of this. I mean, she starts off the game outside of the initial power structure, being on the bottom of Luvu, to the point where I suspect that she would have been the first boot had they gone to that first tribal. While she does create a strong bond with Erica, Erica herself starts to get targeted later in the pre-merge, to where I think those two were very clearly on the bottom. And while Heather wouldn't have been the immediate boot by the end of the pre-merge, as obviously Erica's threat level had increased by that point, it's still not great. I mean, yes, we do know that she supposedly had a good relationship with Deshaun as well, but how much was Deshaun really going to fight to keep Heather in the game? We obviously see her at the Tiffany tribal go and try to create this plan to blindside Nasir, which almost ends up in her getting voted out herself, which is obviously really terrible. And we see her kind of bumbling around the next day and trying to repair her relationship with Nasir, which I just think is overall a pretty bad look there. However, all these things said, it's like she is technically in the majority for the entire post-merge. She's technically voting correctly at every tribal she attends, and like, that's something to be commended. But I really just don't look at Heather's game too favorably. But the main thing keeping her as high as she is here is this element of that she probably wins if she gets to the end in a Deshaun Xander final 3, which wasn't out of the realm of possibility. But even in that situation, she fails to convince Xander to make that possibility a reality, which is also a knock, even if that situation is true. So I still think she played a mostly mediocre game. She is here at number 8. Now number 7, and here we do have Liana. And Liana is a strange figure to assess here, because I do think Liana, for the most part, plays pretty well position-wise. ways. Like, again, she starts off the game in that majority girls alliance, and while she is undercut in the edit along the way, I do think she plays well enough during the pre-merge, especially with her building that bond with Shan at Shipwheel Island, has the knowledge is power, and while she does lie to her group initially about it, which does lose her some trust there, it's like I think she overall plays the pre-merge very solidly and comes into the merge in a very strong position where she still has the ties to Yasa, but also has the tie to Shan, and now has the All Black Alliance as well. And through that is like perfectly positioned in the game. Now, she obviously does have the knowledge is power play where she does get outplayed, and that is a knock against her game, but not really a major one to me from an actual game standpoint. I think really the worst thing it is for me is her perception and how that allows other people to perceive her as a non-threat moving forward. That, along with the fact that she is so close to Shan to where everyone perceives her as a Shan lackey, which is explicitly said, closer to the point where she is booted. And it's like, I think those are knocks against her in terms of her perception to a jury, to where like I find it tough to believe Liana would win a jury vote in most situations due to the fact that I just don't think the jury respected her game that much. And I do think part of that comes from her age and her lack of life experience, but also it's like she just blatantly does these things in the game that do harm her overall perception. But even beyond that, I don't think she plays that suboptimally. I mean, she is part of the Tiffany vote out, which again, like a question mark on whether she should have been going for Evie and Tiffany, these people that she was aligned with on Yasa. But considering she still had the All Black Alliance to fall back on, it's like I don't consider that massive of a knock. But the thing is that once the All Black Alliance ends up crumbling at the point where Shan is eventually booted, she's kind of left without a paddle there. Like, I don't know how she really gets to the end at that point and how she actually ends up winning the game at that point. However, I will also say that I do feel like she goes home at the final 7 due to a lot of just bad luck. I mean, she has Danny winning immunity at final 7, and also Deshaun having to do or die in a position where he ends up not dying and ends up getting immunity, and through that Liana is the only person left in the minority to get voted out there. So again, I think that's unlucky circumstances on her end. And again, I do think she plays pretty well for the first half of the game, but it is really her ruined perception to the jury, along with the fact that I just don't feel like she's able to recover well after Shan boot, that leaves her here at number 7. Now number 6, we're moving on to what is actually already the final Yasa member. And here we do have Xander. And I know there's a lot of talk about Xander should have won, and I personally don't think that's the case. Like, I don't think Xander played that good of a game. And I know a lot of people really prop up this notion of, oh, he was an underdog the entire game, but he was largely an underdog due to his lack of agency within a lot of the game and how much the other players were kind of tricking him throughout the game. I mean, very early on, it's like he does vote out Abraham. He is part of that vote, but through that vote, again, he ends up on the minority on Yasa to where it's either him or Voce, and he's in a position where he's probably getting voted out for the majority of that round until the last second where the vote flips on Voce due to nothing that he actually did. And beyond that, he's in a position where he's getting voted out if they go to another tribal, but just doesn't. Now, obviously, along the way, he does find the idol, and he does also have an extra vote that he's able to hold on to for the majority of the season. But the thing is that he never does anything with those advantages anyway, despite having them in his corner to be able to make potential big moves in the early merge, but just never ends up executing on it. Outside the fact that he does kind of utilize the idol to keep him safe throughout some rounds, though, again, it doesn't really gain him that much in the long term. Obviously, at the merge round, again, we do have the play of countering the knowledge's power, which is a good move, but I always said that, again, like, it's an obvious move. Like, it's one that, like, obviously, if you know someone has the power to steal an idol, if they're able to correctly guess the person who has it, then obviously you're going to hand it off to the person within your alliance that is the least likely person to be perceived to have it. So it's like, obviously he's going to hand it off to Tiffany. It's the obvious move there. So it's like, yes, it's a good move, but it's not one that I'm like overly giving him too much credit for, especially when he ends up on the minority of the vote. Like, he ends up being on the bottom anyway after that vote. The Tiffany round's probably the round that he utilizes his idol the best, in that through that he's able to not get the votes to directly come for him, Now, I do question why at the final 11, as it really doesn't make much sense why they decide to put more votes on Tiffany at the end of the day than Xander here, as, again, he doesn't end up playing his idol. So they could have easily just sniped him out of the game, but whatever. The final 10 is a massive point in the game where I just feel like this was a massive blown opportunity for him not to keep Evie in the game. Now, I do know that obviously he did have some mistrust in Evie at this point. And like, while it does technically work out for him moving forward, where the flip against Shan does end up happening, again, he had nothing to do with the flip on Shan. And he was really at the mercy of Ricard in order to pull off that move, to where I feel like if he had been able to keep Evie in the game, which he would have been able to do had he used his extra vote there, or even his idol, though again, extra vote makes more sense, I think that would have been a much more beneficial move for him, where they would have outright had the numbers come into the Shan boot, with him also still having an idol at that point as well. Again, he is part of the Shan boot, but again, he is shown to be one of the least important people into making that move happen, even though it does greatly benefit him, finally putting him in a power position within the majority alliance. Now, the show gives him a lot of credit for voting out Liana when it's like, there was no other option. It's like the Shan and Danny were both safe, the two other people in the minority, and obviously he's going to keep Ricard around, someone that's in his majority alliance at 7, in a position where if they didn't, they would have come into the next round 3v3. It's like, why would they not keep Ricard around? Again, like another position where I feel like he gets too much credit for voting out Liana here. Especially when like he uses his extra vote here in a position where like supposedly he used it to threaten Erica into not flipping, when it's like, didn't matter. Like, this is under the assumption that only Erica would flip, which makes no sense considering Erica would have obviously taken Heather with her to flip if she was going to flip. It's not like she's just going to single-handedly flip to vote out Ricard, which even if that does happen, it's a tied vote anyway, or what's stopping Heather from changing her vote on the revote? But if Heather ends up flipping her vote along with Erica, it outright doesn't matter anyway. So again, like, this entire extra vote situation with Xander was such a wasted opportunity there. Idol play, same thing. He doesn't use it until final 5 in a position where he doesn't even need it anyway. And then at the final 4, he makes a pretty bad move in taking Erica to the end, despite the general assumption being that Erica is the biggest threat left in the game, and allows the two more beatable people in the Shan and Heather to face off against Fire. So again, to me, it's like, yes, he gets to the end of the game as an underdog, but does so with very little agency, and even at the points where he does have agency, he's not making the right decisions with that agency. So for me, I never thought Xander played that good of a game here, but again, he still made final 3. He didn't play a terrible game, but to me, I just feel like the remaining 5 people we'll be talking about played much stronger games, and that's why Xander's here at number 6. And now we're at the top 5, and for me, the top 5 here are the top 5 by a lot. Like, this is a pretty definitive group for me. The question is the order, and at number 5, people might disagree with this, but at number 5, I do have the winner of the season. I do have Erica. And Erica is such a strange case here in terms of her winning game. A really weird winning game, not because of like how little screen time she got, because that's not what I'm basing this off of, but more so because of how lucky she gets in the game consistently in the game. It's like she does start off okay, where she is part of the initial power structure with her, Shan, Sydney, and Danny, and she also supposedly had a very strong relationship with Heather very early on, so again, that's good. But then we get the entire episode 4 fiasco, which is also like not portrayed supposedly in the way that happened in reality, where supposedly what happened is that the Shan wanted to get rid of Sydney and approach Erica in order to make this move. However, Erica was incommittal to this move, and because that, the Shan gets sketched out by Erica to where he is now targeting Erica. And on their show where we see Erica approach the Shan about taking out Sydney, that's her knowing that the Shan wants to get rid of Sydney, now coming back to him, committing to the plan, despite the fact that he's already moved on and is now targeting her, which is not great. While people talk about how, oh, the show showed Erica to be making a bad move, that's not how the show really portrays that scene, where the show really props up Erica during that scene, talking about how big of a threat she is, when in reality, again, I do think that is a bad move, that she is incommittal to the Shan's plan very early on, to the point where he is instantly willing to flip the game on her, to the point where they're trying to throw the immunity challenge and just fail at doing so. But if they had been successful, Erica would have gone home. Like, it had not been for Nasir clutching it out during the episode 4 immunity challenge, Erica goes home in that round. So again, something that was very luck-based for her. At the merge, hourglass twist. If it doesn't happen, she goes home. If it's a normal merge vote, the consensus was to vote out Erica. If it had been the initial group being safe, as it should have been, had the hourglass twist not happen, Erica would have also gone home. Again, like, she blatantly goes home, and she's even admitted this herself that she would have gone home had that twist not happen. So again, another massive knock. She genuinely survives the Tiffany round, but at that point, again, Yasa was just a big underdog conglomerate that needed to be taken out and weakened at that point. And she also seemed to not have much agency in how that played out. But then we get to the split tribal, where again, like, she wins immunity in a position where Shan wanted to get rid of her. Now, I don't know if that actually happens because, again, supposedly the target was Nasir coming into that round anyway. But if Shan really wanted to, she could have used her extra votes in order to really force Ricard's hand there into voting out Erica. Though I will say that the one positive here is that she did build a strong bond with Ricard to where he did want to keep her through that round. Then we get to the Shan boot, where I think it's mostly Ricard that pulls off this move. However, the show gives Erica credit here for splitting the vote, which is like very obvious thing to do. Like, it's not that impressive of a move here, though the show does give her credit for it. And Final 7, once again, the show does give her credit for picking between Ricard and Liana, though again, to me, it doesn't make game sense for her getting rid of Ricard at that point, where if she does so, she's making a 3v3 in the next round. I do think she plays the final 6 round pretty well. I think getting rid of Danny was her optimal move there, keeping in the Shan, someone that was more willing to work with her, while also keeping in someone that was more beatable at the end, and also someone that it just made all the sense in the world, despite the fact that Shan drops a truth bomb, which is just still dumb. Final 5 round, obviously she has to vote out Ricard, but like, again, this is another situation, very luck based. She ends up finding the advantage in a position where like everyone else walks by it. She's the last person to even be able to search and ends up just randomly finding it. And through doing so, she ends up getting advantage in the immunity challenge, where she barely wins against Ricard, in a position where if Ricard had won that challenge, he gets the final 4 in a position where he has 2 chances to make it to final 3, in a position where he probably wins, where Erica would outright lose in that situation. And we have also final 4, where Xander decides to take Erica to the end, but due to very little that Erica actively did. Now, if this was a situation where like, oh, Erica was playing up how good she was at fire making the entire season to lead up to this moment, then it would have made this a more impressive move. However, I don't feel like that was the case. I think this is simply a luck-based situation of Xander having an incorrect read, and just felt, again, overall non-purposeful from Erica's end. And she ends up winning at the end, largely due to her perception of being a big threat, despite the fact that, again, to me, it's like there's very little to make her a big threat to begin with. It just seemed like a natural perception that was built very early on in the game, where like even early on, we're hearing Shan talk about how big of a threat Erica is and how her survivor IQ is very high. And like, again, to me, it's like there's very few active things that Erica does to cause her actual win. However, again, she's still this high. She does win the season in pretty dominant fashion. Again, a 7-1-0 vote. Despite how lucky she ends up getting throughout the early portions of the game, I do think she is a pretty big power player at the end portion of the game, particularly after the Shan vote. I do think she is a pretty important swing vote during the Liana vote, during the Danny vote, technically during the Ricard vote. Like, she is technically the person calling those shots. So it's like, that's the things I mainly give her credit for. Also with continuing this perception of her being a dangerous player that ends up giving her the win. So again, like, it's enough to be number 5 here, but I do have massive holes with her game throughout that make me struggle with putting her much higher. Now number 4, and I think this is one of the toughest spots to rank here, as I think this person played very, very well for the majority of the season, but I think their game kind of crumbles, and that person is Shan. Now, again, Shan has an incredible pre-merge section of her game. Again, the fact that she's able to so easily dominate the Uwa tribe is really insane. The fact that she builds one-on-one bonds with literally everyone on that tribe and is the main decision maker on every single vote in that tribe is insane. The fact that she's able to get JD to give her the extra vote and proceed to vote him out. The fact that she's able to have Brad think of her as his number 1 and give her all the information on all the advantages in the game. Again, that's impressive as well. The fact that Genie decides to go for Ricard over Shan in her last round, despite the fact that Shan was even there for most of the day. Again, also very strong stuff on Shan's end. And then coming to the merge, she's once again in a power position. again, is part of the All Black Alliance, has this really strong relationship with Liana, still has a really strong relationship with Ricard. They become the core power structure moving forward for the next few rounds. But I do think her game really crumbles from a few things. Obviously, like her arguments with the Shan, that's not great. Definitely creates incentive for the Shan to eventually flip on her. But really the main knock here for me is the Nasir boot. I do think her letting go of Nasir was really bad on her end. Nasir was someone that wholeheartedly trusted her. And really that's the general theme of Shan's game, is that she continuously voted out people that trusted her in the game, where she spends the entire pre-merge voting out Brad over JD, despite Brad more blatantly showing trust to her. Voting out Genie over Ricard, same thing. It's like, that's not great. And for her to do it again with voting out Nasir over Heather, I do think that is a knock as well. And that really leads her into a position where coming into the final 8, where she's left with less options at that point, where she kind of has to go all in on the All Black Alliance. It has the kind of hope that that group sticks together, which they obviously don't. And largely due to her sloppy gameplay of her telling Ricard, which again, like, credit to her relationship with Ricard that caused her to do that. I think that was a more of an emotional move on her end. But I do think it's indicative of her as a player, where I do think she is a emotional player at points. And through that, I do think that gives Ricard the ammunition there to really flip the entire game on Shan. And now we do know post-game that supposedly she was sick throughout the entire game and was on the island for most of that day, and plays into why she probably didn't get the read of her being in danger. But again, she still gets voted out with an idol in her pocket. It's like not a great exit there, especially all the way back at the final 8s, when the next 3 people we'll be talking about all made a few more rounds into the game. But I feel like Shan is a person that, again, like, if she had made it through this round, she would have been at the final 7 with a 4-person alliance with an idol in her pocket, in a position where she probably wins a jury vote if she gets to the end. Now, she has talked about if she had gotten to the 4 with the other black players that she would have bowed out at 4, which is bad, but it's also like not really within the game. But I don't know, it's a weird situation. But either way, again, like, considering how dominant she was early on in the game and how she did take control in the early merge section of the game, I did decide to leave her here at number 4, despite the issues I have with the later portions of her game. Now number 3, and for me, 3 and 2 were very, very close. These were pretty much interchangeable, where I think one had better chances of winning the game, but didn't make it as far, while the other one made it far, largely due to the actions that they made, but also struggled with winning the game. But I did decide to go with the earlier boot here for number 3, and that person is Danny. And Danny, for me, again, like, I think he is a pretty competent all-around player. I think Danny, if we're doing a pure player ranking based on how I would assume that they would do on any given season, Danny is pretty high. Like, Danny is one of the better players on the season to me. Again, he is a good enough physical competitor. He is a pretty solid social player, and he's a solid strategic thinker as well. Like, I think he is a competent all-around player, and I think that is represented by the game that he played on this season. Again, like, very early on, he's part of the core power structure on Luvu, along with the Shan, who have a very close final 2 to where I don't think they ever turn against each other, in a position where he probably wins against the Shan if they get to the end. But he also builds an extremely close relationship with Sydney. Now, through that does make Sydney a target, where supposedly the Shan did want to take out Sydney to weaken Danny. And also, I do knock Danny a bit for not building a relationship with Erica and Heather, which ends up really causing his demise at the end of the game. But still, he was still pretty well positioned in the early sections of the game. Comes into the merge, and Deshaun becomes the initial target over him, which is pretty insane, where Danny is not even talked about as a target, despite him being one of the few people vulnerable at that first merge vote. And be honest, like, he's kind of just there along with the All Black Alliance, along with the Shan, in voting out Tiffany and then Evie. And then it's the Shan boot, where again his game kind of crumbles, where obviously along with the Shan, they flip against the Black Alliance, vote out Shan, and through that puts them on the bottom moving forward. He gets through the final 7 round largely because he wins immunity there. Though even then, I feel like the Shan probably would have been the target, though obviously if the Shan wins immunity, then like Danny's kind of screwed in that position. But either way, he does actually end up getting voted out of the final 6 over the Shan, seemingly due to the fact that he didn't have relationships with Erica and Heather, the 2 people that made it to that portion of the game, while the Shan obviously did. That being said, I think Danny had very strong relationships with the people that were taken out before that, where it seemed like he had a good relationship with like people like a Tiffany and a Sydney. And if those had been the people that made the end game instead of Erica and Heather, I feel like he would have been in a much better position. But I think he kind of like accidentally, because I don't think this was definitely on purpose, him letting Erica and Heather make it further in the game to people who are much closer to Shan, that ends up causing his downfall here. But even then, like all around, like I still feel like Danny played a pretty solid game. I think he's in a position where he wins if he gets to the end against anyone but Ricard and possibly Erica. But I think he for sure beats the Shan, which was his plan to get to the end with. And I think he beats Xander. Like I do think Danny is a strong contender to win the game if he gets to the end. It's just a struggle for him to make it there at that point. But I mean, he's technically closer than certain other people. But I do think he was closer to a win than most other people we've already talked about, and was in the majority for more of the game than someone like an Erica, who obviously does end up beating him. But I do think Danny played a pretty solid all-around game. He's here at number 3. Now number 2, the person that we just kind of referred to, and that person is the Shan. Again, for me, the Shan is someone that I really debated over who is better, Danny or the Shan. Again, I think Danny for sure beats the Shan if he gets to the end. However, I think the Shan obviously did the work to get to the end. He built the bond with Erica and Heather to where they wanted to keep him around at the final 6. Now, I do fault him for the truth bomb at final 6, which is really bad. And really, he kind of lucks his way to getting to the actual end from that point forward, where at the final 5, he's really only saved by the fact that Ricard is such a massive threat in the game. And at final 4, he has to win fire making to get to the end into a position where he loses at the end. Again, like that's not great. But I do think the Shan's early game is much stronger. Again, right off the bat, he is part of the initial power structure on the Luvu tribe. And while I think he is a bit too flippy-floppy early on, again, I don't love him instantly trying to undermine Danny by getting rid of Sydney. And then when that doesn't go through, instantly flip the game on Erica despite him having a good relation with her. Like, I don't think those are good moves for him. But it does at least show him having more agency in the game. We obviously see him at the merge where he's successfully able to avoid the minority putting the votes on him, where we do see him organizing the split between Evie and Sydney and is able to survive that round despite being a big target at the merge round there. He obviously becomes a massive swing vote at the Evie vote, which I do think is very impressive how he was able to completely snow Evie and Xander into thinking that he was on their side. And is able to blindside Evie there. He's obviously part of the Shan blindside, though I do think a lot of that was him more so being tricked by Ricard into making the move. As again, I do think it was a move that was completely against his best interest. And moving forward, he's on the bottom from that point on, being saved by the do or die in a position where if he had not had immunity after do or die, I do think he gets voted out there. And as I mentioned before, again, he saved the final 6 dudes' relationships with Erica and Heather, but then kind of lucks his way to the very end afterwards and still struggles to win a jury vote. Again, like it's not great in the grand scheme of things, but it is a game where he did have a lot of agency for first like 2/3 of the game. And it's really his move against Shan that really loses him all the power in the game. But in comparison to Danny, it's a very similar game that's really just decided by the argument of what is better. Danny having more win potential despite being outplayed technically by the Shan, or the Shan having very little win potential but still outplaying Danny by keeping the trust of Erica and Heather. And I decided to lean in that direction. But again, I think this is still a debatable choice. But at the end of the day, the Shan does land here number 2. Now number 1. And again, it's weird that this person's number 1, as I do feel like with most seasons, I would not have this sort of player at number 1. But I do think they played a really strong game here. And at number 1, we do have Ricard. And again, Ricard played a strong game, not a flawless one, which is why I do have hesitancies of putting him at number 1. But again, it is pretty strong. I mean, like right off the bat on UA, he is technically not in the initial majority alliance, though he does build a very strong bond with Shan that ends up carrying him really throughout most of the game. I mean, that's really what carries him throughout UA, where like all the exit interviews from the people on UA have talked about how they didn't have that good of a relationship with Ricard, specifically the Genie and Brads of the world, to where like, I think if they had had their choice, Ricard would have been one of the first few boots, but they didn't do so to not upset Shan. Though along the way, we do also see that Ricard is kind of the strategic mastermind of the two, being one to tell Shan to take the extra vote from JD, being the one to create the plan on how to steal the idol from Genie. And again, he does seem to be the more active strategic thinker of the two. And coming to the merge, they're able to work alongside the All Black Alliance to essentially hold the numbers and the control for the early portion of the game. However, he did always feel like on the bottom of that grouping, obviously. But he's able to do some pretty good moves along the way to undercut Shan that allows him to pull off the move at the final 8. I mean, obviously, he takes out Nasir, someone that did seem to be very loyal to Shan, and is able to convince Shan to even waste their extra vote in doing so, which is a pretty great move there. Though I do question if it was probably a bit too early, considering Nasir did also have allegiances to Ricard. But again, like, I do think overall it was a pretty solid move, especially when it was keeping Heather and Erica in the game, who he supposedly had a good relationship with. And that's the thing also, is that Ricard does very well socially after a merge. Like, despite the fact that he does very bad with building social bonds with the original Uwa tribe, he does do a very good job at building bonds post-merge, where supposedly he was very close to Tiffany. Supposedly he was very close to Erica, to Xander. He does seem to be a very solid social player after the merge. Also, we have him at the final 8. Pull off the big move of the season. Blindside Shan with an idol in his pocket. His closest ally throughout a lot of the game. The person who I do think was a major reason why he gets as far as he does into the game. He's able to pull off this very impressive blindside, even convincing Danny and the Shan to flip against the All Black Alliance in order to vote her out. Now, I do think it was too early, but it was also a position where, again, allowing Shan to get the final 7 with a 4-person alliance and an idol in her pocket is very dangerous. So I get why he has to make the move there. And also, considering a major reason why he's able to make the move happen to begin with is because he uses this information of Shan telling him that he's the target from Danny and Deshaun against her. Like, that is also a major impact here. So again, I fully agree with him pulling off the move here, considering the context, though ideally it would have happened a round or two later. But even despite that, he's able to squeak on by the next few rounds. Final 7, he's able to stay around due to his majority alliance. And again, like, it not really making sense for them to cut him there, as it would put him down in the numbers. At final 6, he wins immunity, saves himself there. And really, from final 6 on, he needs to win out. Like, that's essentially the position he's in. And that's why I do struggle with putting him at number 1, is because he did lack threat management at the end of the game, in the sense that he needed to win out. However, he was so close to actually doing so. Again, like, he wins the final 6 immunity. Final 5, where he does eventually get voted out, he is very close to winning. And this is a lot of the reason why I talk about comp wins as a very unreliable way of getting to the end, is because of situations like this, where Ricard, for all intents and purposes, wins this challenge had Erica not been given an advantage in this challenge that allowed her to slightly edge out Ricard, and through that he loses the challenge and gets voted out. But if he had won that challenge, he would have gotten to final 4, where he would have had 2 chances to win his way into the final 3, in a position where he's guaranteed to win a jury vote if he gets to the end. Like, to me, it's like, I have the fault him for his lack of threat management to the point where he does have to win out, but he does come very close to doing so. And if he does so, he does become a pretty dominant winner. So while I did want to knock him on this player ranking for that lack of threat management, at the end of the day, it's like, I can't really knock him too much, considering he still almost wins despite that. And also, everyone else on this season is just as flawed, if not more flawed. And because of that, for me, Ricard does land here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for Survivor 41. The end of my Survivor 41 coverage here. Now, again, I will be talking about Survivor 41 once again, one final time this year in my Year in Reality TV video, where the last video of the year will be me ranking every year reality television I covered from this year. So, again, stay tuned for that. I'll obviously be back next year with Survivor 42, with all the other shows that there are to cover, which there are a billion of. So stay tuned for those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.